Hi everyone, in today's video I wanted to talk about science and astrology. I have this theory about why astrology works, but before we get into that theory, let's have a discussion. First question is, what is astrology? Astrology can be described as many things, but at its core, it is looking up at the planets and the stars and trying to correlate them with the events that happen on Earth, the events that happen in our lives and also the things that happen collectively on the planet. As above, so below. Multiple ancient civilizations have been practicing their own version of astrology for millennia. Many indigenous people have always looked up to correlate the planets and the stars to their life. This goes all the way from China to India to Middle Eastern countries like Iraq, African countries like Egypt, South American countries, and just so many more places, which is a whole other video. The point being that human beings have weirdly always looked up and looked for an explanation, a divine explanation in the cosmos for the chaos that is their lives. At its core, astrology is a mix of many different things. Of course, it involves looking up and looking at the stars, math, geometry, astronomy, but there is an element of divination to it. It's just a big mix of a lot of subjects, but it's also its own subject. Us astrologers know that astrology works. We know that astrology is valid. People way before us have been practicing astrology, and to us, it is no surprise that it's a magical concept that works. But even so, science doesn't really regard astrology with the respect it deserves. So, why is that? Why don't we have a scientific proof for astrology? One reason is, surprise, surprise, white supremacy and colonialism. When white people invaded and colonized a lot of indigenous people across the world, they tried to dismiss their practices by calling them illogical or superstitious. This was a way to disregard their methods and their minds and to kind of give into this notion that indigenous people, black and brown people, are stupid, they don't know what they're talking about, and they need white people to save them through the colonization. Of course, this is not true. Indigenous people have been knowing shit for years. Even today, as great as science is, a lot of it is rooted in that same white supremacy that tries to dismiss anything that isn't logical. Now, of course, science is a great thing, no one here is anti-vax. We love vaccines, we know the earth is round, we have a brain that we use. But the scientific community is still functioning with this sort of bias, and they think that their disbelief is logical, but in reality, their disbelief itself is a bias that they hold that impacts their opinions. We don't have a scientific proof of astrology because scientists have never considered it important enough to find proof. They've never considered it important enough to look into, to study, because they think that it's all bullshit and they don't even try to research about it, which is kind of ironic because scientists are supposed to research. Due to these colonial mindsets and their own biases, scientists never bothered to look into astrology, and we don't really have a scientific proof for it. Which leads me to my next point. Do we need a scientific proof of astrology? No, we don't. We really don't. Something doesn't need to be scientific for us to observe the value in it. We all know it works. We don't need a paper published by Columbia University to tell us that astrology is real. We know that. Now that it's established that we don't need a scientific proof for astrology for us to know that it works, I do want to say that I come from a little bit of a science background and I have always loved astronomy before I got into astrology. So it's always been really fun to see how astronomy correlates with astrology and to kind of find these connections. And that is what I want to do in this video. I would love it if I am the person who finds a scientific proof for it, even though we don't need it. It's still fun. We can still theorize, we can still expand our minds, and that's how I would like you guys to take this video. Just, theorizing. It's that Jupiterian, Mercurial thing. We want to keep our brains working. You're always pondering about things, and that is the point of this video, to kind of incite discussion and inside this kind of way of thinking. I have two main theories that I want to talk about today. The first one is something that a lot of us may already know, And this was inspired by just my own kind of knowledge and also something I read in a book. The first theory involves gravity. Every object with mass has a gravitational field, and two objects with mass exert a gravitational force on each other. We have a formula for that, but I'm not going to get into it. The point being, this gravitational force affects the object, obviously, and that is why we have tides on Earth. The moon's gravity affects the water in our oceans and results in the tides. And we've all thought about this at some point, that if the moon can have this effect and affect the tides on Earth, why can't the moon affect other things? Or why can't other planets that have a way larger mass than the moon have an effect on us as well? Who knows if there is something within this gravity, some other force that affects us. Of course, this is simply a theory for now. We will have to look into it so much more, and hopefully we do that. But until then, this is something to think about. The second theory is the star of the show. It's the one I kind of realized on my own because, like I said, I've been into astronomy and I love looking at the life cycle of a star. I even wrote a blog post comparing the stages in the life cycle of a star to types of tarot readings. It's really interesting, it's linked below. But this theory is about how our solar system formed and how we are all kind of connected to everything. This is the nebular hypothesis. We all know about a stellar nebula, which is this giant cloud of dust and gas and particles. And this cloud, the particles in it are always moving. Due to the movement and the buildup of heat and pressure, a protostar is formed. Now, the rest of the particles, they are still moving, and these clump together to slowly and eventually form the planets. What this means is that our sun and the planets in our solar system come from the same stellar nebula, the same cloud of dust and gas and other particles. Something else that is interesting is that the direction of the movement of the particles within the nebula is the same direction that the planets move around the sun in. It's all determined while we are in that stellar nebula stage. Another interesting thing is that once the star was formed, the heat and the solar winds swept the lighter planets away. So planets like Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, they were lighter and the winds swept them away. And the terrestrial planets that are heavier, Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars, they are heavier and therefore they stayed near the sun. So what this means is that a lot of things about our solar system were determined by this stellar nebula and what was happening inside of it. This stellar nebula determined the fact that the sun and the planets are made of material that originated in the same place. It also determined the position of the planets, the inner planets versus the outer planets, and we all know the role that the inner planets play versus the outer planets and how that's different. The most important thing that the stellar nebula determined was the direction of the movement of the planets. And of course, the movement of the planets is the basic thing in astrology. That is what affects everything, how the planets revolve around the sun. And the way this happens is exactly how it happened in the stellar nebula. Now, that was about the planets and the sun, but what about us? We are made of many elements, but the four most important ones are hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen. We all know that inside the core of a star, hydrogen fuses to form helium. But what about the other elements? Now, distant stars that are bigger and who are much older than our sun, they form carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen. And when these stars go supernova, these particles are burst out into space and eventually they reach us. Other important elements that we are made of is iron in the blood, calcium in the bones. But where does that come from? When even bigger stars go supernova, magnesium and iron are again burst out into space and eventually they reach us. We don't know which stars, which random atom in our body is from. All we know is that it is from a distant star. And all we know is that the planets in our solar system, including the Earth, all originated from the same cloud of dust. So it is not that far-fetched and it is not crazy to think that we all share something and we all have this intimate bond with each other And this bond is something that may or may not be able to explain using our current technologies. And even if it's not, the fact that we can tell that there is a connection is itself really magical. So that was my theory about why astrology works. Again, you don't need science to prove astrology. We already know it works. And this video was to just have fun and theorize. I really hope you liked it. I would love to hear your theories about why you think astrology works. The fact that we're made of cosmos doesn't just make us special, it also makes our relationship with the cosmos twice as special as we already knew it to be. So stay connected with yourself and with the universe because you're one in the same.